registration information on our social media portals about that. So if you would like to attend that, look out for information about that. Let's see, anything else I need to remember with this one? I think that's the main stuff coming up in the short term. Before I turn things over to our main speaker this evening, occasionally we have sort of what I like to call micro speakers who speak before our main speaker to talk about various things. Like we had sci-fi author Chris Brown here a few months ago promoting his latest book, Tropical Kansas. This time around, we're doing something that we haven't done before, but we at the board feel that we want to spotlight this because we think our constituents will probably be interested. I'm about to turn things over briefly to let you all be spoken to by Steve Kling, who is running as the Democratic candidate for State District 25, which is Dripping Springs, more or less. We generally at EFF Austin try to remain a nonpartisan organization. We mainly focus on the issues. So this doesn't really necessarily count as an official endorsement per se. That being said, we think Steve's policy is very much along the lines of what our members want to hear when it comes to what a candidate is going to be promoting when it comes to technology and internet policy. So we're going to let Steve speak here for a minute to you guys, and you can all ask him questions. So, yeah, Steve, why don't you take it away? Oh.
Thanks, Kevin. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Kling, and I am running for Senate District 25.
Senate, sorry.
Yes, so no problem. And it encompasses everything from southwest Travis County all the way down to northwestern Bexar County. It's approximately the size of Delaware in terms of, it's fairly large. There's about 1 million people out of the 30 or so million people in the state of Texas. We're broken up into 31 districts, and this is, by the way, the fastest growing district in the United States. It has 3 of the fastest growing counties in the United States: Hayes, Comal, and Kendall. And what we're seeing is a convergence of Austin and San Antonio into a megaplex, or a metroplex, if you will, for better or for worse. And it's the hotbed of that growth, this district specifically. But what I want to talk to you guys tonight about is the technological landscape, the techno-political landscape, if you will, and why it's so important that we're getting more and more involved. The top line of my outline for tonight, which isn't all of that much, but it's we need less dinos and more nerds in our legislature. We need, and what I'm getting at is that we have people who don't even understand the concept of net neutrality, for instance, that are going to be asked to make our laws. And we have, just as we had a representative who wrote legislation for women's health who didn't know what a hysterectomy was in our legislature, and this is for real, this happened, this passed legislature. I think the ladies know what I'm talking about. It's offensive that that is. It's equally offensive to me that we would have someone, being 22 years in the tech industry here in Austin, to have people who are being expected to write laws to govern things like net neutrality, to govern things like rural broadband and economically disadvantaged broadband for all, if you will, who have no concept, who don't even write their own emails, who have someone else do that for them. So I think it's really important that we get involved, because what we're seeing is, and you guys know where the battle lines are drawn here, it's effectively telecoms against everyone else in this industry. And when we look at what's going on, I think about a couple of years ago when someone sent a tweet that I thought was one of the most brilliant tweets, when it talked about the need for regulation. And it was a picture of a rotary dial phone, and it said, if telecoms had gotten their way, you'd still be using this. And it's very true. And right now, I preach into the choir when we talk about the absolute necessity of keeping the internet neutral, not providing these fast lanes. But when you hear the telecom lobby talk about it, it sounds pretty good, if you don't know the rest of the story. And that's the problem. They're the ones up there paying full-time lobbyists to be up there constantly in the ear of our representatives who have no idea how to really use their phone properly in some cases. And it's that bad, it's that real. So I'm not up here to even talk to you about, hey, support my campaign because I'm a fellow, IT geek. I am, but I'm up here to talk about the importance of getting off the sidelines and getting into the game, because the battle lines are drawn. And I understand the need to be bipartisan. I think that's actually very important, because there are many Republicans who understand, who come from the IT industry as well, or have a decent enough working knowledge of it to understand the importance of keeping, of maintaining net neutrality for all of the rest of the IT community that is not a telecom, for instance. And so they're out there. But at the same time, I do think it's important that you understand that there is a need to get politically involved. If you are involved in technology, you need to have picked a side on this issue, because it's going to come down to not just net neutrality, it's going to come down to crypto too. We all know this. Crypto, we're seeing over the past couple of years with the government trying to force backdoors into Apple's technology, for instance, on the auspices of our own personal and national security. If we allow that to happen, the real story is not the occasional exploit of the backdoor, which will happen. And by the way, those backdoors will be opened by all of the people that we did not intend them to be opened by. No question about that. But the real damage, the real concern that we have, and we should understand, and we should be getting out there, and we should have our elected officials understanding, is that crypto, unbreakable crypto, is so much more important in the finance, in our individual finance, and our individual, maintaining our individual privacy, and more importantly, in terms of transactional finance. If they can break that, and if it is breakable, it's made breakable, then we are all vulnerable. Not just on an individual level, not just our identity being stolen, etc., which is happening already at an increasingly fast pace, but we're talking about transnational banks being able to be broken into and being brought down. All of our transactions, the trillions of dollars in transactions having every day, being vulnerable if we don't have unbreakable crypto. And when you really think about the devastation that can happen if those types of things, if those systems are brought down, it would make, as unfortunate as it would make what am I trying to say, a terrorist act seem like small potatoes. It would be a global economic catastrophe, potentially. And so I think it's really important that everybody understands this, and that we understand the need to get involved, and we understand the need to have representation in our government that understands these things. And the last thing I wanted to mention, and thank you again for giving me the time, is that there's obviously kind of a culture war going on. I don't like that term really, but when we look at what happened in the 85th legislature, we're talking about things like bathroom bills. And I think the one thing, if we look back at the 85th legislature and we understand why the bathroom bill didn't pass, it was because of the pressure from the business community. And it was because of companies like Apple taking a stand. It was because of our IT leaders in this community in Austin, Texas, saying that this is going to cost us jobs, this is going to cost us opportunities. People, you will turn Texas into a pariah, because the IT community has a culture that's far more in common with the West Coast, for instance, than with, well, we'll say North Carolina, because one of the states that tried to pass a bathroom bill. And we have to make sure that we are keeping that pressure on. We have to make sure that we're electing people that understand that if they're going to start going after our most vulnerable people, if they're going to start going after our LGBTQ community, that not only is that morally and ethically wrong, that it's really bad for business. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is to enlist our IT leaders and our IT communities to get more involved, to get more publicly involved in our politics, because I can promise you the other side already has. Now, I'd like to go ahead and now open that up to questions. If you want to ask me about something about myself or my stances on a particular issue, I'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, so that we don't, take too long before we get to our main talk, I'm going to say basically 2 or 3 questions from Steve here. So, does anybody have any questions?
So, do you cover Belterra? Do you have any materials?
I do cover Belterra, and we do have materials.
Great.
Yes.
I want some.
Okay, great. In fact, the Senate district's so weird we had it printed on the back.
Oh.
It's egregiously gerrymandered. Is all I have to say.
Yeah.
That's what I say in good company. So, but yes, I do have material, absolutely, and I would appreciate your support.
Yes.
My website is cleanfortexas.org, and I would very much appreciate you taking a look. I've got my issues are out there for everyone to see. I'm one of these guys that never thought I got into politics. I went in the military. I joined the military after 9/11 and did a couple of tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I realized that service for me is the most important thing, is the most fulfilling thing I could do. And after 2016, I felt like the same pull that I felt after 9/11 is to get involved and to try to help save my country, because I feel like our democracy really is on the verge here, and these things will be decided in the next few years. Yeah.
How do you know you're right?
How do I know if I'm right about which?
Your issues, your stance on the issues. How do you know you're right?
Well, you want to take net neutrality, for instance, or
Like, how do you know that once if your stance on issues becomes law, that it will have the outcomes that you desire? How are you sure of that?
so I'm going to choose one of those issues. Net neutrality, for instance. I've been in the IT community for 22 years. I've been in startups since I got out of college. I watched the internet come into its own, and I've watched the internet economy come into its own. I understand the damage that can be done by setting off fast lanes for certain for those that are willing to pay extra for it. When it comes to crypto has gone from being something that nobody even knew anything about to being something that you absolutely have to know something about in order to prevent your identity from being stolen, to prevent your laptop from being ransomwared, and having to pay $500 in Bitcoin to somebody in Russia to get your photos back. I think most of us in here have seen what the future holds, and that technology and the importance of being able to protect yourself when you're on the internet has become not just important, it's become a matter of survival, not just for us as individuals, but for us as an economy. So that's just an example of what an area where I say I know I'm right. I guess the only thing I would have to add to that is that I'm someone who is constantly seeking to learn and seeking to understand, seeking to look at other perspectives. And I think that's just something that we don't see as often as we should. I think that something should be out there more often. It's one thing to come in and think you know all the answers. It's quite another to come in and say, I don't know all the answers, and I'm going to seek out the expertise that has it, and go beyond those who just come to me with their own agendas. So I hope that's a fair enough answer for you.
Does anybody else?
It's an answer.
It's
All right,
pretty open
Tom,
question.
for last question for Tom. Yes.
I'm not sure if this will affect on the state level, but what's your opinion on regulating companies like Facebook and Google?
Oh, well, I think what we've seen come out of the come out of Cambridge Analytica is I do feel there's a need to be able to opt out some of your personal. There needs to be more of an opportunity to be able to opt out of that mining. I think it's fascinating what they've been able to do and all of the information that we self-report on, but it's also very frightening, and I think most people don't truly understand when they sign that 50-page EULA that they see the first moment they click and create their Facebook account that changes every other month, that they need to be more informed and they need to have retroactive ability to opt out of that sort of thing. Because what we saw from this election is that Twitter and Facebook would go and literally send paid employees to go sit with, for instance, the Trump campaign. I'm sure they did it for any campaign that wanted to pay for an embed, that's fine. But having that information used against you, being able to sell a third of Twitter's copy space or ad space to Russian interests, we're starting to get into some transnational things that supersede our national interest and our national security for money. And that precedent, to me, speaks to the need for people to be able to protect themselves and for our country to be able to protect itself as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Kevin, thank you again.
I want to thank Steve for coming to talk about that. I want to thank him for avoiding the usual cynicism of our community and actually trying to run to get more like-minded people in office. So I want to thank you for that.
Thanks.
All right, on to the main event. So, yes, our speaker this month is Randy Langford. Randy, well, I find it very amusing that Randy actually in his bio puts first that he makes music, but relevant to his talk tonight, he is a lawyer, he teaches at the university level, and specifically he is a lawyer who is involved in, as I believe I will not say incorrectly based on my talks with him, there's basically a sort of community of like-minded lawyers that he basically is involved in discussions about what he's been speaking to you about tonight, which is namely the idea of dynamic agreement, which is specifically he's applying to like its uses in contract law, but more broadly, he hopes it can provide a better non-adversarial legal framework going forward, as opposed to our current litigious system. So I'm not going to explain too much for Randy. I'll let him speak in his own words. So take it away, Randy.
Thanks, Kevin. So, yeah, my name's Randy, and I'm a recovering lawyer. Now, how many of y'all just really enjoy lectures?
You are among the nerds.
There's therapy. There's therapy for that. I just want to tell you, there's therapy for that. We're not going to have a lecture tonight. We're going to have, using the nomenclature of my upbringing, we're going to have a visit. We're just going to have a conversation here tonight. I'm going to be talking about some things, but y'all feel free at any time to interrupt me and ask a question. If it's something that I know is like 2 slides down, I might say just hold that thought and we'll get to it. Something else that's maybe not involved directly in what some of this information is going to be, then I'm happy to talk about it at that moment. And it's kind of a misnomer somewhat to say I'm here to talk about contracts and agreements, and that certainly is part of it. But that's more of a product of what I believe is the real basis for what we're going to be dealing with and exploring. And I'm going to take us back a little historical trip here. Wake my computer up.
If you need tech help, I'll run out and find someone for you. So
See what happens.
there we go. Yay.
Yeah. So, us being Westerners, we'll tell a little story. It's an important story for us because it has had impact on our lives and lives of folks around the world. And so that story starts way back before the year 1000. And prior to that, people pretty much around the world lived in communities, some called clans, some called tribes, and they were pretty much self-governing. Now that didn't mean that they weren't within a realm of a monarchy perhaps, but those monarchs were by and large political heads. They weren't so much involved in the day-to-day lives of the folks. who lived in clans and tribes and other types of communities. And those folks, for thousands of years, figured out a way to address issues within their community. One thing they figured out pretty quickly is that human beings cause one another a lot of harm. And relationships are difficult. And if every time somebody caused another person harm within a community, that person was either expelled or executed or in some way disconnected from the community, well, it wouldn't take too long before that community would be diminished in strength to such an extent that it would be easily overtaken by the neighboring community, enslaved. So these folks were wise enough to think about how can we address these community issues in such a way that our community is actually stronger because of it, that we're actually closer than we were. And they came up with these processes. We're going to talk about them in a little more detail later. Well, here we are at that 10-6 cousin who lived in Normandy, that second cousin named William. And William and Edward struck a deal, basically, that when Edward was either ready to abdicate the throne or died, that William was going to be his successor. Edward died. I don't know if Edward didn't tell his brother-in-law about the deal he'd struck with William, his brother-in-law Harold, or Harold just decided that he was going to seize the moment in history. But anyway, Edward's brother-in-law Harold just declared himself to be the new king of England. Well, this really pissed William off. And it pissed him off enough that he put together one hell of an army. And he effected what has come to be known as the Norman Conquest of England. And he killed Harold. And he didn't just stop there, but he just kept rolling on. And he established his kingdom and his reign in England. And whereas folks had been living in these clans and in these communities and in these tribes, they, had property that they were working, farming, they had livestock, they had other property that they considered to be their own. When William rolled in, he said, there's a new king in town. And this is how it's going to be now. That cow that you own, you don't own that cow anymore. The cow's not yours. That cow is mine. I'm going to let you use the cow. You can still milk the cow. But that cow belongs to me. And I'm going to even go one step further. You belong to me. You're not an autonomous being any longer. You're my subject. William then, after making that declaration, he had to set up a governance to enforce that declaration upon the people. Because as you can imagine, some folks didn't take that too well. So he had folks who were his political confederates, and he went out amongst in the country and he built castles. And those castles became known as the King's Court. So now, if Kevin had a cow, and I went and stole Kevin's cow, whereas before, that would have been something that Kevin and I and the entire community addressed because it was a community issue. It wasn't a community issue anymore. Now it was between me and William. Because I hadn't stolen Kevin's cow, I stole William's cow. And I would be called into the King's Court, and a judge there that had been placed by William would decide what I was going to do to make things right with the king. Not with Kevin, with the king. Maybe I had to pay a fine. maybe I had to work in servitude to the king, lots of different ways. And as time passed, and those determinations, those rulings by the king's court became somewhat similar throughout the kingdom, they began to be codified and turned into law. Okay? Well, we're just going to pause right there. Push the pause button and think about that. Okay? We had a community scattered around in an area of the earth. These communities were kind of self-governing, and they were doing so in kind of a collective, collaborative way. Doesn't mean that people didn't, on occasion try to seize power, but that wasn't how the system was set up within the communities. Mainly because the communities were based on a particular social philosophy. Now, William's idea of community was based on a particular social philosophy too. And in his social philosophy, he resided right at the top of it. And it looked like a pyramid flowing down. And the power started at the top, and it was distributed vertically, and it was very authoritarian. And that was the social philosophy on which Western civilization is based. And the social philosophy that has been disseminated around the world as a result of colonization by those societies that adopted that social philosophy. And in this conversation that we're going to have, when we talk about philosophy, all we're really talking about is an approach to things. How do we approach it? So here's grasscity.com. I just went online and I've typed in, it's basically people's life philosophies. And this is what came up on grasscity.com. Okay? Live, let live, don't interfere with things that aren't your business, let all your emotions run freely, and never be afraid to express them to others. That's somebody's life philosophy that they govern their life by. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we get high. You never know when you're going to get. That's another person's life philosophy right there, okay? Be good. Try your best to do no harm. I'm a tiny organism on a tiny planet with a tiny sun in a tiny segment of a tiny galaxy in the middle of trillions of galaxies. Life is meaningless. There's a few others. Work hard. Be diligent. Vigilant. Never stop learning. Live life with a purpose. Do psychedelic drugs. Have no regrets and live in the moment. If it makes you happy, do it. So just think about those people's life philosophies and think about whether or not you think they would have an effect on how they live their lives, how they engage people in relationship. Well, folks who have studied this all their lives and over the centuries have concluded that philosophy affects the structure, systems, and institutions and culture of a society. We talked about William's approach, his philosophy. His philosophy was one of hierarchy and vertical power distribution. And that was the society, the social philosophy on which Western civilization is based. This is what it looks like. When you start talking about governments, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. When you talk about architecture and institutions, that's what it looks like. It affects things and in this society and as to how even the architecture is constructed. And think about systems, justice systems, other systems. That's what it looks like. Who's sitting head and shoulders above everyone else in that room? Okay? The King's Court. There is another way, however. There's another approach, another philosophy. And it's the philosophy that the folks were using to guide their decisions prior to William rolling in there and instituting his hierarchical philosophy. And it involved horizontal power distribution. Looked kind of like this. This is Native American, but you can look at clans and tribes around the world and you're going to see the same, basically the same approach. A collaborative, co-creative, consensual approach to making decisions and dealing with issues within community. Who's in charge there? Who's in charge there? Who's the leader there? Even people who have a role that may seem to have power that comes along with the role, in these kinds of situations, that power is diminished, it's neutralized. So, philosophy, they tell, I've read, and folks have told me who know, really affects our perspective. It really affects our life philosophy, our social philosophy that a society, which a society is built and maintained. It really affects the perspective of the people who live in that society. And perspectives for the, in context of what we're going to be talking about tonight, is just understanding. How we understand the world, ourselves and one another. Kind of like that. And like that. And like that. And like that. Our perspective determines how we're going to understand ourselves and the world around us. And that perspective is really a product of the philosophy that we live by. And that all affects and effects our reality, the world we live in, how we live our lives. So that gets us to this whole idea of agreement. Y'all may be saying, what in the hell does any of that have to do with a contract? We're going to explore that. Because agreements, as probably all of y'all have been a party to, and I use that term party, or contracts that you've entered into, have all been probably very similar. And the reason they're very similar is because the people who constructed them were lawyers, and they all went to the same law schools, and they passed similar bar exams, and they wrote all those contracts that y'all signed. They're probably not really understanding what they said. You just took a lawyer's word for it. And those contracts or agreements, what they deal with is who, what, when, where, and how. And they're legal, so they make sure that they are addressing the legal rights of the parties that are entering into the agreement. And those conventional contracts, I don't know if y'all can identify with this, but I certainly can, they're pretty impersonal. Because in the ones that I've entered into, I was just letters on a page. No different than the start date and the end date and the amount of money that was gonna exchange hands. They talk about parties, they don't talk about people. Because people is not a term of art in the law. Parties is. Human beings are not a term of art in the law. Parties is the term of art. A party is a legal designation. It's not an identity. They're adversarially negotiated. If you ever had an opportunity, mind you, a lot of contracts just basically, somebody drops paper in front of you and says, take it or leave it. However, some of them you enter into a negotiation, but those negotiations are adversarial in that people are posturing. They're trying to either gain advantage or not lose advantage over the other person. And they're static. The contract that y'all have entered into, it was just a conventional contract, was simply a snapshot of a moment in time when two people signed their names and dotted it. And it was rigid to the four corners of that document. And if anything happened that substantially affected the terms of that agreement, it's considered a breach. And the only way conventional contracts deal with breaches is through some type of adversarial process, litigation, mediation. They all pretty much look the same because they're about the law. And the law is pretty much the same, state to state, and it's federal situation, it's all over, it's the same. And, they use the lexicon that only lawyers know. For good reason, they don't want you to know. I can tell you, they don't want you to know what the language is that they use. If you understand it, then they're out of a job. So here's a typical, partnership agreement, and this is everything that this contract is going to address is the start date, the end date, the consideration, purpose of the agreement, and the names of the parties. That's the only blanks to be filled in. Why are they like that? There must be some damn good reason why contracts are that way. Remember about approach? About philosophy and approach being basically synonyms when it comes to how we live our lives, how our society is governed. It's a matter of approach. Conventional contracts, they're based on Williams' social philosophy. Vertically distributed power hierarchy. They are a product of a philosophy. The lawyers, the people who are up the food chain of power, they create those contracts and they focus on the transaction. They don't focus on the relationship of the parties because the relationship of the parties is a product of the transaction in conventional contracts. And they use the right language to threat litigation if you don't comply with the conditions of the contract. Lawyers are not trained to help people get along. Just want to tell you that right now. I know that may be difficult for people. But lawyers are trained to fight. They talk in language that is battle language. They talk win-lose language. This approach is based on laws, not on people. It's adversarial.
It's about arguments, and it's about lawyers doing the talking for folks. It also makes lawyers a lot of money. Now, I'm not painting lawyers as devils, because there's some great, my friends that are wonderful human beings. However, I don't think it can be denied that many of them, maybe most, are lawyers because they thought they were going to make a lot of money by doing it. There are a few that do a lot of pro bono work or work for nonprofits that are somewhat altruistic and idealistic, but I think they would be in the minority for the most part. So the system that is a product of the philosophy exists to settle arguments. And it does that through litigation, and there's a lot of money spent on it. The median cost is about $91,000 for a breach of contract case. So remember, that approach to contracts is directly related to William. Directly related to William. And the social philosophy that emanated from his decrees, and the way he structured things. But there was this other way that existed prior to William, that we haven't talked about too much. And there are some folks that are around the world, many of whom are lawyers, who have been considering that, you know what, maybe systems and approaches and processes based on some powerful European king and his desire to rule everything and own everything, maybe that's not the best approach to use. Maybe we could rethink this thing. And so there are folks around the world, I am one of them, I guess, who have spent some time considering a different approach to agreements. And we'll get to why the idea of agreements is so important in just a minute. So dynamic agreement is just a term that we can use to describe this different approach to agreement. The dynamic agreement facilitates collaborative co-creation. Kind of those folks sitting in a circle talking about things. It documents why, how, who, what, and when, and where. Okay? Documents that. And the how, however, the why is very important. You noticed that in the conventional contracts, why wasn't an issue. Why was not even a consideration. Nobody gives a shit why. Conventional contract. It's not important. And for the most part, how is not important. No one cares how you're going to do it. You just better do it. You better comply with the terms of this agreement. We don't really care how. You just better do it. So why and how are really different in a dynamic agreement, and they're, for the most part, not present at all in a static agreement. Change. Change in a static agreement usually results in a lawsuit, or can anyway, oftentimes. It's approached a little differently in a dynamic agreement. And the rights that are protected by a static agreement can still be protected in a dynamic agreement. You don't waive any rights or any of that kind of stuff through this process. Here's what you need for a dynamic agreement. In a static agreement, all you need is a transaction in two parties, and they don't even, it doesn't even make any difference if they're coerced into it. They can't be coerced under duress and those types of ways, but
you know, there are lots of ways to coerce people to enter into agreements that aren't illegal. And so there doesn't even necessarily needs to be people coming together voluntarily. In a dynamic agreement approach, the agreement is the product of the relationship. So whereas before the static agreement, the relationship was a product of the transaction, right? In a dynamic agreement, we've said, wait a minute. These are human beings that are entering into this agreement. Maybe the relationship ought to be at least as important as the transaction. And so the transaction becomes a product of the relationship. In a static agreement, you don't care what someone's values and principles and motivations are. As a matter of fact, those things usually don't even become evident until somebody breaches the agreement and people are calling lawyers and it goes to court, and that's usually when those things are sussed out. You usually find out what a person's real motivation is, what their values are really important to them, whether or not, you know, honesty or integrity or whatever is important to them. That's when you find out, not before they enter into the agreement. In a dynamic agreement, the whole idea is maybe those would be good things to know before you enter into the agreement. In a dynamic agreement approach, change, challenges, and conflicts are normal. If there is one thing that is a constant in the lives of human beings, it is change. To pretend as if it doesn't exist or will never happen is a fallacy. It's a legal fiction. And it's setting people up for problems in agreements. So a dynamic agreement says, hey, you know what? We know change is going to occur, and there are going to be challenges in relation to this agreement. And, you know, conflict might well be present as well. And that's all normal. That's just part of people living in community. And let's figure out a way to address those things so we can maintain the agreement and, you know, make changes if we need to and move forward. Then protect those rights. So here's what's needed. Here's the process. People want to come together in agreement, and they place value on the relationship. Human beings come together and they place value on the relationship. The process for creating the dynamic agreement is you address some questions, some prompts and questions. There are about 15 of them. They're not trick questions. They aren't rhetorical questions. They're not even questions about whatever the agreement's about. They're just open-ended questions, basically asking people to tell stories about their experiences. And those questions are not to trap them. Those questions are to help them discover values and principles and motivations that are important to them. Not judging any of them as good or bad or right or wrong. After people respond to those questions, then somebody, like me, will look over them and in a very non-scientific manner will try to glean from them values and principles and motivations that are present. If someone's telling a story, and the story is, yeah, I hired a guy to do landscaping at my house. And the guy never showed up on time, and he didn't do the work the way he said he was going to do it, and he walked away from the job before it was even done. Now, I might read that and say, it appears to me that you like people to be, that personal punctuation, being punctual, is important to you. That integrity is an important value to you. That honesty is an important value to you. And that's what could be gleaned out of a story like that. Those reports then that come out of those questions are shared amongst the people who are considering entering into agreement, so they can look at one another's reports and decide if you know, I have some questions about this, or these particular values are a concern to me. I'll give you a quick example. I was doing one of these things for a person there were two people who co-owned a duplex. One of the people one of the co-owners was going to live in one of the units, and they were going to rent the other unit out on the other side. And the other co-owner had her own house. And so they, put a for rent sign up in the yard, and sure enough, somebody came by, a couple came by, and they rented applied to lease the duplex. They did the background check, and these people who were the landlords, did the credit check, and they did all the things that they were told to do, and they said, okay, we'll lease this duplex to you, and they signed the conventional Texas Realtors lease. About 4 months later, in the middle of the night, those folks loaded up a U-Haul truck, and they were out of there. And they absconded from the lease and left these folks in the lurch. Well, they came to me and they said, you know what? We did everything exactly the way we were told to do it as landlords, and that didn't work out too well. Would you be willing to maybe use this dynamic agreement approach to help us in the next one? So, okay. So they put the sign back up in the yard again. People came by, a couple came by. They showed interest in it, and the folks who owned the duplex said, we would like to use this dynamic agreement approach. Would you be willing to answer some questions, just respond to some questions and some prompts? We'll all do it together, and we'll bring in this lawyer who will walk us through the process. And the folks said, yeah, we'd be willing to do that. So they all responded to the questionnaire. I produced the reports. I distributed the reports to everybody and telling them, if you see anything that's of concern to you, you have any questions about, just let me know, and we'll address those collectively between all 4 people. So sure enough, the co-owner who was living in one of the units calls me up, and she says, hey, I have a concern about some of the values, or at least one of the values that showed up on the report here. And I said, okay, what is it? And she says, well, both the husband and wife of the couple, both of them show on multiple occasions that lawfulness is an important value to them. And I said, okay. What's your concern with that? And she goes, well, I work hard, and on occasion I like to sit out on my back patio and smoke a little weed every now and then. And maybe this might be an issue. And I said, well, now I understand. I think that's a legitimate concern. And so I said, would you like to have a conversation with these folks to see if that would be something that would be a concern to them? She said, yeah, I really would. So contacted them all. We sat down. Sure enough, these people said, if we were to come home and would have seen you sitting on your patio smoking marijuana, we would have been out of here. And we would have already have incurred the cost of moving in, and we'd be fighting over a security deposit and all of this stuff. The long and the short of it is, everybody was happy that they didn't rent the duplex out. They were all happy. They had come to an agreement, a consensual agreement. The consensual agreement was, we're not a good match for the purpose of this agreement right here. So, anyway. So this process we're talking about there are 3 sections to a dynamic agreement. As you saw with a static agreement, there's really one section. There are a bunch of paragraphs and a few clauses in there, but it's basically just about the transaction and who's going to sue who and how they're going to sue one another if there's a breach. Well, a dynamic agreement, there's three sections, and the first section is called foundation statement. And the foundation statement addresses that why, the why that is not addressed in a static conventional agreement. And the why is the values and the principles and the motivations of the people. and whether or not they can come together and create this foundation statement so it is at least acceptable to everyone. Like, all of the values don't have to have equal value, and the motivations don't even have to be the same, but they need to be acceptable to one another in order to enter into it. So here's some of the questions I was telling you about that are on the questionnaire. Express a life philosophy that guides your decisions and actions. If you had a magic wand you could wave and create your ideal world, describe the world you'd create. What do you want from this relationship and agreement? Why do you want that? Motivation. Tell a story about an agreement you entered into that involved an ongoing relationship. Describe your experience as it relates to the relationship with the other person and how your life was affected by that. So anyway, about 15 of those question prompts, and from that, people can decide whether or not the motivations and values and principles of the other person are acceptable to them. And if they are acceptable to one another, then they work together to create what's called the foundation statement. And if you can see, I have one up here that y'all can come look at after we're done here. But if you can see, there's a vision and a purpose of the agreement, and the guiding values and principles that they come together and they co-create this. This is not a lawyer doing this for them. The lawyer helps them, facilitates the process, but the people, the human beings that are entering into agreement are the ones who create this, okay? The next section of a dynamic agreement is the statement of agreement, and that's the who, what, when, and where. Similar to what you have in a static agreement, except it doesn't use a bunch of legalese. It uses language that anybody can understand, and the reason that anybody who is entering into the agreement can understand it is because they create it. The lawyer guides them and talks to them about the very broad parameters that constitute a legal agreement in whatever state. In Texas, let's just say, and there's some very broad parameters. It can't require someone to do something that's illegal. It can't be unconscionable. It can't be contrary to public policy. But beyond that, people can pretty much agree to anything beyond that. And so the lawyer is just there to guide them through that process, give them counsel if they have questions about it. That's what a statement of agreement looks like. Now this is the part that is the how part. This is the third part. Of the three parts of a dynamic agreement, this is the only part that can't be altered substantially and still have a dynamic agreement. And the reason why is because this is the part that people agree as to how they are going to talk with one another. Because discussion, if any of y'all have ever had discussions or debates, are products of that vertical power distribution, that hierarchical philosophy. Okay? Those are forms of communication that involve win or lose. They're forms of communication that are about trying to persuade the other person to adopt our point of view. Conversation, on the other hand, is born out of that other philosophy that is about horizontal power distribution. And conversation is an approach to communication that is about trying to understand. It's not about trying to persuade the other person. It's about trying to understand, about listening, primarily listening to one another, and expressing ourselves in a way that facilitates listening. So I don't know if y'all have had this experience. I suspect you have if you lived in this country and gone through the school system here, that when people get in your face and they start telling you what you need to do, I stop listening. When someone sits down and tells me their story, they have my attention. So this section, the changes, challenges, and conflict, sets out the approach to communication that's going to be used from the very beginning of a dynamic agreement. And this is kind of sets the tone for that section. I'll read it, y'all can read along. We understand that it is likely unanticipated changes will occur during the course of this agreement. It is also possible those changes may substantially affect our relationship in the terms of our agreement. If we find ourselves challenged by changes or conflict, each of us is committed to working together to collaboratively co-create whatever transformation best serves the needs of all. That sets the tone. That sets the tone for how this process is going to be employed to reach and maintain agreement. And this is what that section looks like. It talks about a facilitated, a informal conversation, just two people sitting down, having a conversation. Maybe there might be other people involved as well as part of the conversation. But having a conversation in a particular way, not a discussion, a conversation. And it sets out the particular way that people will have a conversation. And then it also says, hey, maybe this is like a really complex issue that's arisen. Or maybe things have happened to such an extent that our emotions are kind of flaring up and, in the way of us really being able to sit down and listen to one another. And if that happens, no biggie.
Amber alert, false alarm.
Sorry.
It's not a fire alarm, you can keep going.
But if that happens, it's no biggie. We'll just bring somebody in who knows how to facilitate a conversation like we want to have, who can help us have this conversation. Not mediate it, because mediation is just another adversarial process. Okay, it's about winners and losers. It's an end game. It focuses on the outcome. And the kind of conversations we're talking about is not about focusing on the outcome. It's about focusing on the process. And whatever the outcome is what the outcome is. So, at any time during this process, folks can call up their friendly dynamic agreement attorney who understands the process and can facilitate those kinds of conversations. And they can tell them about any concerns or questions they might have, like the folks did in the example of the duplex rental, and work through that. And once they have addressed everything and people have reached their agreement and have agreed as to how they're going to address things when change occurs, not if it occurs, but when it occurs, and they have agreed that, you know what, conflict is not a dirty word. It's not abnormal. All conflict is evidence of diversity of perspective, which a lot of folks want to celebrate. Because when you have a diversity of perspective, maybe you're more likely to make better decisions. Maybe you're more likely to understand the entirety of an issue with the diversity of perspective. And so conflict is just evidence of that. It's not something to run away from or to be punished for. This is just what a dynamic agreement looks like. Like I said, there's one up here you can look at. So, this really just comes down to one question for me. And I think it's the question that, we all have to address, and we all will address either consciously or subconsciously or maybe even unconsciously during our life. Kind of like those folks who responded to that grasscity.com question. And the question for me is, in what world do I want to live? Do I want to live in a world where people are postured as enemies, adversaries, where the processes and systems and institutions are contrary to people living in peaceful community? If I want to live in that world, then we have the perfect social philosophy for that. Go to the courthouse. Spend a day at the courthouse and you will see the product of that. Okay? And this is what you'll see. But if I want to live in a different world, where people listen to one another, where people try to address issues collaboratively and co-creatively, where they don't consider conflict to be abnormal, but they celebrate it as diversity of perspective, then I might want to engage processes that would facilitate that kind of world, that would reflect that kind of world. And that's all that this dynamic agreement is. It is a legal process designed to facilitate a world where people live together in community, where they collaborate and co-create and work together to make consensual decisions based on values and principles. That's all it is. Thank y'all. Yes,
So
ma'am.
are the questions that you have people fill out the same every time, or does it vary by topic or the specifics of the situation? I'm sure they are related. I was just curious.
Yeah, by and large they're the same, because they're not directly related to whatever the purpose of the agreement or
Right.
the topic of the agreement is. They're designed to provide people an opportunity to discover and to reveal to one another values, principles, and motivations.
What would happen in a case where somebody really worked to undermine the agreement and then refused to participate? Like what kind of consequences come to place? Does it revert back to?
Yeah, you don't waive any rights, so, you know, if that occurs, then people can draw swords and start chopping at one another if that's what they want to do. Yeah.
So you could go back. You can default back to the regular legal system.
The only thing about it is that the change, challenges, and conflict section is a condition precedent to that. So the people agree that we're not waiving our right to litigation, but we're agreeing that before we go there, we are going to have these conversations.
Okay.
Okay?
So it's just an addition. It's not a replacement.
That's right, yeah, you don't waive any rights, you know, by entering into a dynamic agreement. You know, just like it's voluntary for the people to come together and decide that the relationship is important to them.
Right.
You know. Yes, sir.
Is there an app for this?
Thank you for asking that question.
And I was going to piggyback on that and say that I know one of my conditions for letting Randy give us this wonderful talk is we have to have a vague technology angle. So
Okay.
why don't you go about that first?
Okay, well, I hope it's not too vague in the not too distant future. So I'm currently working with 3 other people, 2 of whom live in Seattle right now, to develop an app using an artificial intelligence algorithm that gleans the information from those responses to those prompts and questions as I glean that information from them. And so the app will actually produce the reports and will facilitate the creation, assist the people creating their foundation statement and their agreement. Yeah. Yeah, so we have developed the algorithm. We're in the kind of next stages beyond that now.
Where do the questions come from?
Those questions are part of my story is that for about 14 years, I worked in the area of restorative justice. Restorative justice is just the term that the West has given to the approach to justice that these indigenous people used for millennia. And those questions are born out of questions that these ancients would ask in the context of their circles. When you saw those circles, they would ask people to tell stories and to talk about things that weren't directly related to the issue, but that were the underlying basis for the issue. And so that's where those questions came from.
Is there a body of case law that addresses dynamic agreement? And also, how would an LLC and the associated equity with an LLC look differently with your system?
So there's the case law. There are these dynamic agreements. Some people call them conscious contracts. There are several terms that are used, and they have varying degrees of different aspects of this dynamic agreement. I have a lot of experience and a good bit of education in this area of restorative justice and this type of dialogue. So some of the conscious contracts address the values and principles, but they kind of treat the dialogue part as an ancillary, not that important component. I believe that it's basically the basis on which the agreement is established, is this dialogue process. And so that's the reason that this dynamic agreement is a little bit different than some of these conscious contracts that you'll see. But they're very similar, all of them very similar. They're in use now in the United States and in other areas of the world as well. And they are, lawful contracts. They've been upheld in courts of law. There's nothing about them that is not. Like I said, for conventional contracts are incredibly specific, because the more specific an agreement is, the more opportunities to cry foul. Okay, to claim breach, and if a party has breached an agreement, the other party has the leverage on them. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to do away with the relationship or with the agreement, but now they have leverage on the other party. And so it's just it's a continuation of that posture, of kind of adversarial posture. And that's the reason most agreements are incredibly, line after line. See subsection 1.02a, all that kind of shit. That's the reason why, okay? Because they're not about human beings, they are about the law. Dynamic agreements oftentimes are not that specific, because it's about human beings in relationship agreeing to a purpose of the agreement. And part of that means that we're going to kind of work this out as we go along. Like, we're going to have these parameters that we want to understand, but change is going to happen. And so we want to be fluid about that. We want to be dynamic about it. And so they're less specific generally than like a conventional agreement. What was the other part of it?
But just what does an LLC,
Okay.
limited liability corporation, look
Okay.
like with the associated equity under this approach?
Great. So there's another movement going on that involves these ideas. And that movement is generally in Western societies, there have been two types of organizations: a for-profit and not-for-profit organization, right? There are different iterations of those. There is now being developed the idea of for-purpose organization, which is still for-profit. The profit is just one of the considerations, and it's not even the most important consideration. That the purpose of the organization is of utmost importance. Well, people are developing that. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a huge organization in Germany called ENCODE that's working on that, and there's some of the folks who also have been working on the holacracy, Zappos and that kind of stuff. And part of what I think, this is my opinion, part of what has limited the acceptance of that approach is they've tried to institute it within the context of organization as entity. So they're trying to infuse the idea of a for-purpose organization within this hierarchical structure and the bureaucracy of established entities, which makes it difficult, okay? And so they've come up, with these holocratic governance, but they've still kind of held on to the idea that it has to be really rules-based. And I don't know if y'all have ever read one of those holocratic constitutions, but I went to law school for 3 years and spent a hell of a lot of money, and I can't understand what it says, and I can't imagine there are many people within those organizations that can understand them. So they're virtually unusable for me anyway. So I think that it's an evolutionary move. It's for-purpose organization and trying to figure out how it can be implemented within a organization as entity. But there are some folks who see that as, trying to put a round peg in a square hole. And they said, wait a minute, we're still buying into that social philosophy, that hierarchical social philosophy. Like, we're still trying to make this work in this other way that has resulted in these particular systems and institutions and structures of organizations. How about if we just start from scratch? And let's think about organization as agreement. Because now when you think about organization as agreement, now you have people fulfilling roles. You don't have people occupying positions, authoritative positions. You have people fulfilling roles. You have the ability, since you don't have a centralized management, you have the ability to use technology to effect management, okay? And you no longer need an employee-employer relationship because you have people that are fulfilling roles, and it's these are non-exclusive agreements. So people can be a party to many agreements, many different agreements. So I'm actually involved in 2 of those projects right now. One is here in Austin locally, and it has to do with providing services for musicians. So people kind of in the music services business. And it's a for-purpose organization that we're developing right now. The other one is to effect a collaboration between artists in Austin and in Islamabad, Pakistan. And I'm working with a local attorney there in Islamabad who's also a musician and a music producer. And we are forming organization as agreement to bring together artists in these 2 locales, and we're trying to construct the agreement in such a way that it can, it's unlimited. It can be global in scope. So that's what we're working on right now, and that's one thing, because you don't have the bureaucracy that is present in organization as entity, that its ability to spread and populate. It's really just as fast as people want to come together in common purpose, sharing common values, motivations, principles.
So on that note, how does so those entities are probably not tax entities, so they're probably not recognized by IRS. And what about litigation against organization as agreement? I.e., does everybody stand to lose everything if a classic organization sues them?
Right. So it would be, you're right, it's unregulated, right? Because it's not a recognized entity. Entities are legal fictions. They're constructs. I mean, that's why the government can say that a corporation is a person. They created the corporation, they get to say if it's a person or not, right? Agreements are the creation of the people who are in agreement. And so it's not an entity that can be sued.
Right.
It doesn't exist as an entity that can be targeted.
Right.
The individual persons or other individual organizations, maybe there are entities that are a part of the agreement, you know. Now, they might be able to be targeted individually, but not the organization as agreement. Yeah.
I understand that you're working on an app and that there's an algorithm to help facilitate the organization of everything. I was surprised to learn a few months ago that the blockchain is already being utilized as a way for legal contracts to be initiated. And so I was curious to learn if that could perhaps be something that would apply here, especially if there's a financial aspect being integrated into the agreement.
I hope so. I don't really understand blockchain completely, and I'm working on that. I'm really trying to come up to speed on it. However, what I would offer to the process and the opportunities that I think blockchain is going to afford society, that there might be a tendency for it to be used in such a way to remove humanity from the process. And I would hope that somehow folks who are much smarter than me and much more knowledgeable than me, like y'all, would be able to figure out a way to use blockchain to actually facilitate humanity, connection and relationship.
The meeting that was just before this one, I don't think I seen anybody that's been there too. They downstairs? Yeah. That was essentially the message from the guy downstairs.
Yeah.
It was a similar libertarian kind of notion that I think I've heard folks speak about, but applied to the banking, more to the banking system. The work that's going on is still in progress though, because some of the things you hear bad about Bitcoin is being removed, is the assertion. I mean, this is all still to happen. That's what that means. Can I ask another question, which is, are there tools or cute little, I hate to say it this way, but cute little tricks? And what made me think about it, you were speaking of the indigenous people, is a process I remember 15-something years ago, about how do you have a dialogue where everybody can speak and have a chance. It was called Pass the Pipe or Peace Pipe. First of all, has that been applied in this? And are there other such techniques, just that even if we can't get around to a dynamic agreement, we could get around to agreement in a smaller city? Is there a book or something you might recommend?
So this thing that I've been talking about, like this is not an agreement. This memorializes agreement. Okay. Agreement happens between human beings, right?
It's a process.
And so you're 100% like the passing the talking piece.
Yeah, talking stick.
I use that talking stick, you know. I use it whenever I facilitate dialogues. We use something like a talking piece.
Are there more?
Because, well, there are all types of techniques that are involved. Yeah, things like centerpieces, talking pieces, how people express themselves in first-person narrative form, how they're asked to attempt to listen to one another in an active and empathetic way. All of these things are the techniques that were developed by indigenous people. Yes, sir.
All right, you and then you again.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, you first.
I got hung up on you said the dynamic agreement attorney produces reports, right?
Right.
What's the purpose of that? It sounds like some bit of a translation layer in the process. What's that for?
Okay, so the report is just, the questions, let's go back to that real quick. Okay, here's some of the prompts. Prompts are questions, okay? These are a sample of what they would be on this questionnaire. In the process I use, there are 15 prompts or questions. And so they basically ask people to tell stories about their experiences. And it's through the telling of those stories, just like with the indigenous folks that we were just talking about, it's through the telling of the stories that people oftentimes reveal values and principles and motivations. So the dynamic agreement attorney is just a person who has some training to be able to read those prompts and glean from them, not in a scientific way, in a non-scientific way, but glean from them what appears to be their implied or expressly stated values and principles and motivations. And then that's what comprises the report. And then the report is shared with the people who are entering into agreement, not as some authority that these are the values and principles and motivations that you have, but simply that these are things that may be reflective of values and principles and motivations that are important to you. And these are values and principles and motivations that may be important to the other person. And it's the impetus for conversation. That's where the conversation begins, right there.
So it begins with the reports. Do they get the raw input as well?
Only if they both agree to share that. Okay, they have to both agree to share that. But they can exchange that if they want.
And why was that deemed necessary part of this dynamic agreement process?
Because that's the basis for the foundation statement. A shared vision, a shared understanding or acceptance of the purpose of the agreement, and shared or acceptable values and principles and motivations.
But you said they don't have to accept the reports, right?
No, in order to enter into agreement and to co-create the foundation statement, those things must at least be acceptable to them.
So they all have to see the reports as acceptable? Like, I'm trying to figure out, do they need to accept the translated language? Or, I mean, because they don't have to agree to share the raw information.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think what you're trying to ask is, can a person go to the dynamic agreement lawyer and say, you misunderstood me, but you gleaned these are my values from what I said, and actually no, I would not say those are what my values are.
That's not my question. That's an example of I guess you could call it a concern. It seems like, you know, from a high level view, you don't need this producing reports part to kind of achieve the things that you want out of using the dynamic agreement versus a static conventional agreement. So I'm still unclear as to why the reports are a necessary aspect of the process.
It's been found in my experience that if I ask someone what values are important to you, they are going to tell me what they think I want to hear. Okay? However, if I ask them to tell a story about a particular experience or a situation, then through the context of how they perceive that experience can reveal a lot about what values and principles and motivations are important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because someone may state that, you know, their motivation is X, Y, and Z, maybe incredibly altruistic. However, in the context of telling stories, it may show that maybe they're a little more motivated by financial returns or, you know, benefiting financially than maybe they would if you just asked them outright, you know, what's your motivation here? And that's the purpose of this. This is not to produce, you know, this isn't producing a report that is indisputable. It is producing a report to stimulate conversation. That's what it's about. And stimulate conversation in a way that is something more than people just saying honesty and respect and truthfulness are really important values to me. Yes?
Okay, you get a story out of a person, but can you get this, apply this to like entities like municipalities and corporations, because they are agglomerations of people.
Well, this is applicable anywhere that people are living in community, working in community, engaging one another in relationships.
Person to person, I understand this, but we also have these things that have been created around us that are, large organizations that have the ability to form contracts. Is this applicable to them? To a corporation, an Apple?
Yeah, it is being used right now. I have a friend of mine she actually lives down in Rockport now. She's trying to rebuild her house after the hurricane. But for a long time, she was an attorney in San Francisco. And she used this approach to agreement for tech companies with suppliers, that type of stuff, that there were tech companies up there who bought into this approach to agreement.
I wonder if you know about sort of it's kind of storytelling thing. I mean, I can see that particularly people do hear it. I've read a lot of things about organization culture where that kind of causes people to bond and sort of get some sort of ongoing relationship that they're invested in. But if all you really want to know are like the constraints that are going to drive the agreement or keep it from happening or something, there's this another approach that a group called the moralfoundations.org or something does, where they do ask kind of trick questions. But I think they're trying to get to the same kind of constraints, like what are your values, particularly around kind of moral issues, I guess. And I just wondered if you were familiar with that or have a, I mean, so what I would say is like, wow, this sounds like it would take really a long time. Some people would just say like, I can't, just give me that contract. Just especially if you're getting paid by the hour. It doesn't sound like you are when there's an app, at least. But there might be something where, because I can see like from an AI standpoint, it's like maybe pretty quick we could say, oh, you map into this same sort of point in moral space, or value space, and that's the basis for the contract. And there may just be other approaches to get to the same place, but you might lose something.
Well, people often talk about this. Seems like a time-consuming, inefficient approach to agreement, and I guess my response to that would be, you've never seen a lawsuit. Okay?
Sure.
And so, it's kind of what I always try to reduce things down to like interpersonal relationships. If I'm in an intimate relationship with someone, and I decide maybe I can operate from a position of power, and I use that power to dictate how things are going to be. Someone, because maybe they're dependent on me for something, let's just say it's in a employee-employer relationship, someone may do whatever they're being dictated to do momentarily, but over the long haul, that's going to be a costly decision on my part. It may take me longer to sit down and listen to the person and come up with collaborative decisions. However, the likelihood that those decisions are going to be implemented in a way where the person is motivated through, inspiration rather than a carrot or a stick is probably going to result in much more efficiency down the road than at the moment.
Well, and there's also an AI that's appreciative inquiry that's all about figuring out what gives life and energy to your organization. So it has me thinking about a commitment to both understanding what those are and continuing to fan those flames as part of your agreement.
Yes.
So I've heard of things called benefit corporations. Where does that fall in the conversation that you've had about?
Benefit corporations in Texas, they're recently recognized, and they are for-purpose organizations. They're for-profit.
Mm-hmm.
They're not for profit. They're for-purpose organizations that are created specifically to effect a purpose, and they, their structure is the same as any other corporation.
Okay.
And you have the same hierarchical structure and bylaws and that type of stuff, but they're just they're given some consideration because they are focusing on purpose.
Is anybody using this in terms of human relations and hiring practices?
Well, interestingly, the two folks that are up in Seattle that are part of the team that are working on the app, both of them have marketing backgrounds. One is the dude who's coming up with the algorithm, and the other one is a marketing guy up there. And they have determined that the hospitality industry is the prime candidate for us to launch this app. Bars, restaurants, hotels, resorts. Simply because it's very important in those areas that the people who are having the interaction with the clientele reflect the values and principles and motivations of the organization.
How do you keep this, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
How do you keep these, I mean, you're asking a lot of personal information from people. It seems to me like open door to discriminate, like the landlord, oh, we don't like their values. Or, I mean, I understand it's a little more difficult, the landlord lives there, but I thought, like we were talking about in the hospitality industry. Okay, we like this person, we've interviewed them, they're great, they have great references. Oh, but they're of this religion. Oh, or of they have their personal background, which wouldn't come into any sort of, I can't see how this would come into play in their job. It just seems like it's ripe for discrimination against people.
Well, I'm not sure which one of those questions ask any of those questions, but any of that information. Typically, that's not the responses to those
Like
problems.
life philosophies and things like that.
I think sort of the question is like people could get around current protected class laws via the smokescreen of I don't agree with their values when it's a smokescreen for I don't want, say, African Americans frequenting my business or something.
But don't these issues go back to property law, which is the very beginning of law? And there are things I can do in my home that wouldn't be permitted in a place like this because it's a public place. You're coming up with something that's a private property of that
But they're
person
asking
who's
about
got
it.
that room to rent.
But I think that their questions bring that stuff up.
Yeah, fine. And I should be entitled to have all the prejudice I want in my private use of my private property.
But if he's talking about the
And I think
hospitality
that's by
industry
law.
and who he's hiring, that
Oh, wait, that corporation's a private corporation too. Maybe we've impugned on them too with all this.
Yeah. There are many instances where people just choose not to respond to some of these questions, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not about that. In other words, the responses to the prompts and the questions are not sacrosanct. They are not indicative declarations of these are the values of this person. That's not what they are. So people oftentimes just don't respond to some of them, depending on what the prompt or question is.
So I had a follow-up to my question earlier, which was, so why, and I think it ties into what you just brought up, but why don't the people involved who are, trying to come to an agreement, why don't they tell the stories directly to one another? Why do they talk to the attorney?
I know. My experience has been is because that's not how we've been conditioned in this society.
So it's not required for them to do that?
What's that?
To talk to the attorney?
There's no requirements. This is people are coming together in these agreements because the relationship is important to them. That's the very first thing.
So they can produce the reports themselves?
They can have any conversations they want to have themselves. They're not, this isn't like the standard approach, the conventional approach. The conventional approach is you keep the parties separate. This is, you bring the parties together. You want them to dialogue. You want them to talk.
Okay, so they can create the foundation statement through whatever process they want.
They can enter into an agreement all by themselves. Yeah. People call me because in our society and in our culture, we have been taught to communicate in such a way that makes collaboration and co-creation difficult. And so this is just a process to use to facilitate a particular means of dialogue.
So, okay, so we've been learning about dynamic agreement, TM, like trademark, the structure of the agreement that they come up with and the steps in the process, none of those are required.
Well, there's some things that are required in order to have, if you want to have a legal agreement, there's some things that have to be present or not present in order for the agreement to be legal. If you're not worried about a legal agreement, then none of those things are required. I can tell you though that, you know, if you want to have an agreement where the way that you address change is to fight with one another, then that's not going to be a dynamic agreement. That's going to be indicative of a static agreement. And so there's some differences in the approach.
Okay, so like you had a slide with the 4 check marks where you had address change, all the why, how, when, who, where. And if you meet like kind of those 4 check marks, you have a dynamic agreement regardless of what process you went through. And
You have a dynamic agreement if you agree to enter into agreement using a particular process that is based on a particular approach to dialogue, to conversation.
But you want, in most of your transactions, you want some form of authority, some form of common ground. And there's a little thing up there you forgot. There's a thing called TM. That's his way or someone's way of making sure that you don't have to go through all of this dialogue and all of this thinking through. You trust him. That was what part of the thing downstairs is we're going to have new systems that are going to build chains of trust. That's one of the things the guy's working on. So that's your trust system. Let's call that a trust mark, right? Trademark.
I thought we just established you don't need a dynamic agreement.
That was small t, or small d, small a. But to have a dynamic agreement that he's been talking to about for the last hour or whatever, it starts with having some form, otherwise we'll always be reinventing wheels around here. So you and I can have a nice small d, small a dynamic agreement, and they're done a lot, I'm sure. But to get to something that has some further thinking out of more situations, enabling perhaps more people to get involved, and all sorts of values like that, there still is that anchor point of some form of certification.
Let me know if I've been way off base here. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that, and this is 100% correct, if people here have ever had an ongoing, intimate relationship with someone that was based on respect and love, you had a dynamic agreement. That's it.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. What are the?
Yeah, that's it, because probably the two people who are in that relationship aren't dictating to one another. They're probably not laying traps for one another. They're probably
hopefully.
Yeah, probably being respectful to one another. And when they go to make a decision, probably one of them is not saying it's my way or the highway. Okay, they're probably making that decision consensually. So relationships that are healthy relationships are dynamic agreements.
It's only when you have this fast marriage of you're trying to rent that extra space and they came in and there was a light, then you went from there with this procedure. And there was not yet enough courtship.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is not new stuff. This is based on stuff from thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
It's not new stuff.
I have one question that I wanted to ask real quick. So one thing I'm interested, if there's been any evidence of it happening, is so your model potentially stands to disrupt a lot of entrenched systems that give certain people a lot of money and power. We see whenever somebody proposes things like this, that all of a sudden certain laws start getting introduced to make certain things illegal. Like when people start trying to make their own municipal broadband, suddenly lawmakers start introducing laws to make them illegal. Or like with the widespread adoption of solar, suddenly it's illegal to have solar panels on your home in certain places in Florida. Are there people who are trying to pass laws to make dynamic agreements illegal?
None that I'm aware of right now.
Do you have a plan in place for when, if the business happens?
I don't have any plan. You know, maybe y'all can come up with a plan. I don't have a plan.
The only reason
Here's
I was legal
here's
to pop up is
here's
just corrupt.
here's kind of the way I see it is that this approach to agreement conforms with all current law. Okay, so in order for them to to take action or them, whoever they are, in order for someone to take action to try to in some way make this approach to agreement illegal, there would have to be a change in contract law. That's what would be required. And because contract law is so steeped in the history of codified law from way back from the old country across the pond, I mean, contract law is hundreds of years old. And because of that, I doubt seriously that would occur. However, anything can happen. Yeah.
One question I have is, how long have you been practicing dynamic agreements, or how long have you been advising people to put these together?
So I went to work on this project about 2 years ago.
Okay.
And I spent about a year doing nothing but studying and reading and talking to people around the world about it. And then I developed it to the point where it could be, some prototypes could be used.
And thanks for sharing that. The reason why I asked that is because I was curious, it's not very much time, but I was just wondering, of the agreements you have put in place, have any even gotten to the point of disagreement and then it needs to go into your traditional kind of litigation? Sounds like that may not have happened yet.
Yeah, so it's, none of my agreements have got to that point.
Right.
And the part about disagreement is, for about 14 years now, my area of practice has been in facilitating people sometimes who are in extreme conflict. When I'm talking about extreme conflict, I'm talking about people who try to kill one another. And so, this is not a formula. It's not A plus B equals C. It is a process that provides an opportunity for people to address conflict in a non-adversarial way, if that's what they want to do. If they don't want to do it that way, there's nothing that can keep them.
Yeah, that's what I picked up too, and it goes back to some questions in the back, was that this agreement's not for everybody, it sounds like, and they're not open to having that type of relationship, I guess, management, and this isn't for them. Which then leads to the other thing, is that if some party is for it and they really want to bring someone into it, if they're not having it, then it really kind of just ends right there, and they just need to find someone else that's more complementary to it.
In the terms of dynamic agreement, it would say that they are not compatible for the purpose of this agreement. In other words, they might be perfectly compatible for going and having a beer and watching a ball game, right? But for the purpose of this agreement, they may not be compatible.
I actually want to springboard off there real quick, because now that's kind of triggering the scientist in me. Is dynamic agreement a process that has a sort of selection sampling bias, where only a certain type of personality would even agree to do agreements like this in the first place?
I mean, I suspect that's the case. It would be something akin to lawyers who choose to practice litigation and lawyers who don't want to have anything to do with it. You're probably going to have people with a certain sensibility in both those areas, right? And so I would think that people who, I think it was one of the first slides that we went up about dynamic agreement, that it starts with two people who regard the relationship as being important to them.
We're getting close to end on time here. Anybody else have any questions? I mean, just you first.
I have. Did you go yet?
Yeah, go ahead.
About the algorithm, is that a trademarked algorithm, or is it possible for, say, other people to come along and impose their own opinion on how that algorithm should run in order to analyze the answers that are provided, right? Because people might use different lingo, or might have, different words might change over time, or their exact meaning might evolve. So I'm curious if that's a trademark aspect of what you're working on, or if that is something that is open to further versions or alternate versions. Yeah, I think that's it.
So you were asking the wrong person about algorithms and how they work and all sorts of things. That's our view of another one of the folks that are involved in all that, who is developed the algorithm.
To put it in Stallman's words, I think he's asking, while this may not, because obviously you guys have to make a living, it may not necessarily be free as in beer, is it free as in freedom? Can you see this algorithm and interact with it, audit it, offer opinion on it?
Right, because it's supposed to reflect your interpretation of those words.
Well, I understand the question, but it would be akin to that same question being asked of me and my personality, right?
Right.
And that's the reason it's totally subjective. Like
Right.
whenever I read responses,
Right.
it's not held out as authoritative. It's not held out as scientific. It is designed to stimulate dialogue. And so that algorithm would have the same design.
Right.
It's not stating someone's values and principles and motivations. It's stating that these may be values and principles and motivations that reflect things that are important to you.
Sure.
And this is an opportunity to engage conversation about that.
Sure, but you've sort of provided the information that is encoded into the algorithm that is going to ultimately create those interpretations. Is that accurate to say?
My understanding about AI is less than what's on that paper, is that it gains intelligence as more information is fed to it. And there certainly would be some process where that would be monitored to some degree, but clearly it would be monitored by another subjective source, like a human being, right?
Okay, so there's other checks and balances too.
Yeah, but it's subjective also. So I can take a look and pick up a report and see what an algorithm, how it deciphered or implied or inferred from some statements that were made. But that would that'd be a subjective interpretation for me as well, just like it's the algorithm.
Right, but is there like a way to rate it? Like say I didn't agree with this interpretation at all, or?
Yeah, we're actually talking about that.
Okay.
So yeah, we're actually talking about that, and because evidently that's already ongoing and happening in that context, and so the tech guy who I'm working with is.
Okay, so there'll be like a machine learning component.
Well, there was another one they used to get everybody, he starts getting other subjective people who all are working in the same thing, and they have created a Slack channel, if you want to say. So when they do find a new abuse of their system, they all get together and sort it out.
Interesting, okay.
So the better thing is open source and Slack channels.
Yeah.
How we do our software.
So probably time for one last question because we are almost out of time. Or if they're quick, maybe two. You want to go first?
So I've gone through some negotiation training over the last few months, and we talked about these kinds of activities, about trying to get from people's positions to their interests, right? And so I want to live in this house or in this duplex, and I still want to do my thing in the evening, right? As opposed to somebody's interest in not being exposed to that, right? And trying to get those two things on the table so that the parties, the people in this case, can form a relationship that works for them, right? And that's what this is sort of really all about, is getting away from positions and understanding each other's interests, right?
That is true.
Okay.
I guess, sorry, your question. I guess we have time for
Yeah, I mean, it's just as I'm thinking through all this, I think this is all really great, and coincidentally earlier today I was having an almost very similar conversation with someone looking to enter a business working relationship with, and just because of my experiences of previous contracts and things like that, this all makes total sense. But it sounds like I can understand the push towards having an app using AI, But to me, I feel that having a certified dynamic agreement attorney, which I think you listed on there as one of the relationship components of this overall, is completely removing that by having now an algorithm that is dictating what all this will be, because there's no relationship from someone actually guiding it now. And then if it ever does get to the point of conflict resolution that's defined in there, now a certified attorney would then come in who doesn't have any relationship with any of the parties, would then be helping facilitate it. So it seems like you're moving this to scale it, but then you're removing the entire relationship component.
You know, we're being purposeful by not doing that. And one of the reasons, one way we're doing that is that dynamic agreement attorney is available from the get-go. I mean, at the time that the people come together. And available in an instance that, you know, someone like me who's operating an analog time would not be that available. In other words, some people could access me via video conference and me be able to help them and facilitate and guide them through the process much more quickly than if they had to call me up and we had to get together and we had to talk about it. At any time that can happen. If they want to meet in person, that can happen, and you know, probably that would occur upon the advice of the dynamic agreement attorney, who would say, it sounds like to me like we probably all need to get together and talk. You know, we're at a place where we need to do that. So that's how it would work out.
All right, well, unless anybody has one last bon mot, I think we are going to wrap up here. I want to thank Randy for a very interesting I want you all know that we, as has been our tradition the last several meetups now, we're probably going to adjourn to Firehouse Hostel and Lounge for an hour of drinks and socialization, so any of you who can make it are welcome to tag along and join us.
There's propaganda up here if any of y'all wants some. There's like, I think 10 copies of the example of these dynamic agreements. It's 9 engagement agreements. Thank you all.
He got no decision to affect somebody's life. But he was the last day.
I wasn't sure I was gonna make it. My handball game got done. Yeah, no, I've already signed up. Check your box.
Yeah, Bob. Well, I don't know whether I need to answer.
Bob, yeah, check the Slack channel I have December 1st. Okay. No publicity.
Then we meet together and talk. So that's pretty interested in this general.
The hippie and the non-hierarchical in me was like, oh, we gotta have Randy.
Well, I gotta say, like, you know, I think we'd probably be pretty good to have like the next 1,000 years be, you know, more based on this sort of cooperative horizontal. But the implication of my talk is sort of 2 years ago or whatever it was, is like probably like the biological decision process, like both of these things are in there and they're actually communicating with certain rhythms or something. So it's like the right ratio of hierarchical to cooperative.
Well, right.
You know, 1 in 10 or something.
Right. You know, finding that
So
right.
you have to like flip between these things and share information.
Good to see you, Bill, and thanks for the help with the drone stuff.
Or at least
I just
that's
good to see you, and thanks for the advice on the drone stuff. We ultimately figured out a solution. Which part? The drone. Yeah. We ultimately figured out a solution. Get a really cheapy one and fly it indoors. Well, we compromised some of it. Well, we would have more stress. We would have so much about the road. That's there was another person I could have given all that stuff. I'm gonna get going. I want to have somebody at some point in the meetup talk about
Wisconsin.
facility road law.
I didn't go. I was talking about this.
Somebody be like, oh, I'm totally down, but we could break this law. Dang it, there's another law.
When I started coming, no, when I started coming to EFF, it was because of the Jackson.
I didn't have the same stamina I have.
But a few months, 2 years ago, we did a network salary. It's gotta be, and I saw some stuff going through that
Seeing all the people.
I don't think there's ever been a meeting.
Yeah, it's gotta be the right time.
We actually not in my
Yeah, and when I was gonna do this, I had no idea.
No, there was. I mean, yes, let's try to revisit some of these things that problem is like, there have been periods where I've had trouble finding something. At this point, I have like a backlog. You're all for months.
Oh man, okay.
Yeah, whatever.
we're always driving.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Like, I'm actually
Satya Nadella was here? Satya Nadella.
Oh, I guess earlier, yeah. You gonna join for the next portion too?
I'm thinking about it.
Drown your sorrows?
Okay, yeah.
It's not my style.
Well, probably healthy, actually. That's not your style. Yeah, I don't know how many of us will be going, but you know, I at least am going because I need to talk shop with Maggie about planning our South by stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, come out.
You want to tell us what's trying to have speakers and stuff?
We're working on a party. Be a little different in style than last year. Probably less seminar and more engaging with a variety of different interesting things all around a theme of technology to facilitate empathy.
Okay.
Empathy spelled really weird is the tentative title for this year's event.
Cool.
So it's going to be different than last year, but it's pretty interesting. I'm just happy to have Maggie on board because she's way better at planning parties than I am. What you saw last year was like me like nearly dying to bring you that, basically.
Yeah. I want to mention that I'm just in the few hours that I learned that I'm not going to have a job soon, I'm thinking that to kind of help build my portfolio, I wanted to offer different people like free writing, possibly like interviews, or especially like people who are doing things that I'm really interested in. So, if you have any ideas of how you might want to use that offer,
writing services. Let's talk.
Yeah, like a mock article or something you can post on your site, like an interview with you or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. No, you're right. You and I will do some emailing and we will talk because we've had Amanda doing a bit of blogging for us, but you know, certainly I'd love to branch out and see what we could maybe do with you. That sounds great, and I'm honored that you want to participate.
Cool.
Yeah, let's definitely chat.
Cool.
I'm gonna do that.
Yeah, you look familiar. I'm sure we have met. I meet so many people. Yeah. I'm horrible with remembering.
No, I went to
I'm good at faces, I'm bad at names.
But yeah, you look really familiar.
It was at
I try to wear the same stuff. I have my brand.
I'm gonna turn into Zuckerberg Jobs one of these days.
My wife's name escaped
I
me.
just started to
Anyway,
work at
like while I was
and
there,
I'm working on my
they showed
show
us
next week.
Oh wow.
And then,
One of my clients, I think, actors finished
and then I got home, and we were gonna get together.
Oh, I would absolutely love to meet you guys and check.